come on up.
Thanks, Richard. Just some good news. We're lucky the 405 project in Sherman Oaks should be finished by the end of this calendar year. I won't guarantee it. Now, that's the good news. If you live on the west side, the bad news is they're a year late, because they found a pipe under Sepulveda that they didn't know was there. No big deal, it just carried thousands of gallons of oil, but other than that. But we are pretty good to go. There's some problems with trees over near Sherman Oaks Circle that has to be resolved. There's a lot of work still needs to be done. I'm going to a meeting along with Patricia a week from this Friday to hear about our piece. The project's divided into 3 pieces. Our piece is the one from the Getty all the way to Sherman Oaks. And if you have any questions that you specifically want asked, come see me after the meeting and tell me what they are. But I'm going to get most of the general dates, and there'll be an update in the next newsletter. Thank you.
Bob, thank you for spending the time on that important project. Okay, let's introduce our featured speaker this evening. Adrin Nazarian is our Assemblyman representing the Sherman Oaks area. He was sworn in December of last year, I believe. And many of you, I first met him when he was Chief Deputy for Councilman Paul Nakurian. And a lot of you may have met him in that capacity. And he ran last year. You were outspent, what? What was the numbers?
Quite a bit.
Quite a bit. In fact, the names of your people forget the candidates. Who are your two other main spending candidates? Brian Johnson.
The main one was Brian Johnson.
Brian Johnson. Remember when we were getting all that mail? Okay. So even though he didn't have the budget, for some reason he won. Because most people say if you don't have number 1 in money, forget it. You're not going to win. But guess what? He did. This is the first time he's spoken here as an assembly person. We also wanted to find out a little about his growing up. Did he grow up in Beverly Hills, San Marino? I mean, what's his background? You learn a lot about a person when you learn about that person's background. So we want to know his background and what's happening in Sacramento. With that, Assemblyman Adrin Nazarian.
This probably doesn't happen very often, but I need to correct Richard.
It doesn't happen a lot because we don't allow it. Okay, want to move on to the next subject?
Well, I was going to say I won because of your endorsement, but since you don't want to hear that, it's a great pleasure to be standing before all of you. I think the last time I was here was when we were in the middle of our campaign, and there was 6 of us in the primary race. Actually, no, I think we had another one between my Republican opponent and myself in the general race. Just to give a bit of numbers and tell you what it means to actually be involved in an election these days. There were 6 of us running in the primary, 5 Democrats, 1 Republican, and the highest fundraising and spending Democratic candidate was Brian Johnson. He had himself raised roughly about $500,000, and he was the beneficiary of independent expenditures to the tune of $1.7 million by 3 different organizations, all located in Sacramento. So you combine that with the money he raised and spent, I was up against $2.2 million. And I had raised roughly about $340,000 at the time. So I was outspent about 7-1. But I think what's more important is I was the beneficiary of work throughout the community. Started out working for a con. I guess this will be a good segue into my background. Right after college, I started working. I was a Coro Fellow for a year, which introduced me to the wonderful world of public service. So I started working for a congressman who used to still represents the Sherman Oaks. He always likes to claim Sherman Oaks as the best named city in the country. I worked for Congressman Brad Sherman from Menengi's his first term of office. Then I went on to work for Governor Gray Davis at the Trade and Commerce Agency when there used to be a Trade and Commerce Agency. That was the agency that was responsible for bringing in business from all over the world and also ensuring that we're increasing our manufacturing in the state and sending out exports throughout the world so that revenue would be generated here. And by the way, that was the agency that had 21 different offices throughout the world marketing California in other parts of the world, and all those offices have been shut down. So as the 8th largest economy of the world, I think there's something to be said about us marketing ourselves outside. You know, we gotta spend the money to be able to let everybody else know what it means to be in California and have California products be shipped abroad. After that, I came back, wanted to work in a local office. I started working for Councilman Tom LaBonge, where I got to represent another whole area of this district, Toluca Lake, Hollywood Hills, and now Sherman Oaks again. And then I worked for a legislator who became a council member, Paul Krikorian, who used to represent Sherman Oaks, also used to represent Valley Glen, North Hollywood, Valley Village, and Toluca Lake in the state assembly when he was in the legislature. So I've been the beneficiary of having some great bosses, working for some great public servants, and having a background in public service arena, especially at the district constituent service level. Now, as a background, since Richard brought this up, I'll keep it very brief. I never really talked about my background during the campaign because it's kind of hard. You only have 15 seconds to get your point across. But just so you know, I was born in Iran. When the war with Iraq erupted, my parents were very quick at making sure my family left so that my brother and I are not drafted into a war we didn't believe in. And my parents made sure that we're not sacrificed for that. And originally, my grandparents had to leave Russia and move to Iran because of the Soviet Bolshevik takeover. And one of my grandparents actually spent 4 years in a work camp in Siberia. So my family has basically been kicked out of every country that they've settled in. Hopefully, that's not going to happen here. So anyway, I came here at the age of 8, and roughly 30 years later announced my candidacy for the state assembly. And I'm very much honored to be representing all of you in the state legislature. So with that, I wanted to give you a quick, brief overview of what's been going on in the state during this last year, and then I'm happy to entertain some questions. I already got one of the questions right here. So, even though I haven't been a legislator myself, and this was my first year, having had the experience of being a staffer, I can tell you that this was one of the most productive years the state has had. We've addressed healthcare. We've been working on it ever since implementing the new healthcare changes last year in a previous legislative session. We worked on education funding and the overhaul of funding, and we're competing on a daily basis on transportation needs of our state, given the opening of Panama Canal and how that's going to be impacting the $25 billion worth of trade that we do in the state. So, by the way, just those 3 committees, just to let you know, I serve on all of those 3 committees. My committee assignments include education, health, transportation, budget, and rules. So it's all the light committees, very light reading also. Rules, by the way, is the committee that governs the state assembly, and all committees, all bills go through rules committee to be assigned to the appropriate committees of jurisdiction. So when it comes to education, we overhaul, education itself is 39%, K through 12 education is 39% of the state's budget, and we overhaul the funding system for that. Up until this year, educators, administrators, school districts had to apply a sundry of categorical programs, 68 of them, in order to be able to get funds for their local school districts. That changed. Now you need to apply for only 5 categories. And these are categories that we cannot have we cannot diminish or change because they're all legally bound to us. They're either federal mandates, state mandates, voter-approved mandates, or lawsuits that have been settled forcing the state to pay certain amounts to the districts for whatever issue or reason there may be. On the healthcare fund, by the way, I'm hoping that this funding change is going to really help schools focus less on where their next dollar is going to come from and be able to have administrators focus more on how they're going to be serving their student populations. On the healthcare fund, we implemented the federal Affordable Care Act, which is expected to increase coverage of healthcare by a tune of about 1.2 million, at least in the state. We can potentially cover more than 2 million individuals, but in the first 2 years, the expectation is for us to hit at least 1.2 million. And given some of the interest that it's generated since October 1st, as of late last week, the numbers were roughly at about 40,000 successful applicants. So it's been fairly impressive. And by the way, healthcare accounts for another 26% of the state budget. So just between the two committees I've already mentioned, that's roughly about 66% of the state's budget. And then on the transportation front, we're trying to compete by making sure that our ports, Port of Los Angeles, Port of Long Beach, undergo the necessary changes in order to be able to stay competitive with Panama Canal, which is undergoing its changes in order to be able to have more freight travel and bypass. If that happens, if they're successful in doing this earlier than us, then we're going to be losing the competitive edge because the ports in Southern California funnel roughly about, I think if I remember the numbers correct, about $143 billion of commerce throughout the country. It's not just the US, it's also Canada and Mexico. So our intertwined transportation system, highways, all have a role in this. The fact that some of them need certain upgrades and or deal with the congestion that they're dealing with, all of those to some extent need to be addressed. But one thing that's positive news is that the dredging, which is the digging and further deepening of our ports, has already begun, and hopefully that's going to be ready in time to be competitive with the Panama Canal opening. So that's a little bit of an overview, at least of the three major areas that are going to be impacting us, not only on a day-to-day basis, but on an economic front as well. I want to share with you very briefly about some of the bills that were passed this last session that I think were productive and are going to have long-term impacts. On the tax policy front, enterprise zones were a contentious issue. Enterprise zones were first put into place to help give tax credits to companies that were coming in, settling in, hiring new employees, had a certain California brand good to it that they were going to be producing and selling. Over time, focus changed, and what unfortunately happened was there were certain manipulations that took place and allowed for fast food restaurants, certain types of entertainment locations, and by and large, areas of business that weren't necessarily the intended target initially to be the beneficiaries of these tax dollars. We're talking about roughly $1 billion, $750 million, and growing. So the governor wanted to change this and brought it to the legislature, and it was a tough fight. I was supportive of it. My only hesitation was that I wanted to insert entertainment industry as a recipient of tax credit as well. Unfortunately, he didn't go for that idea. His focus was manufactured goods, manufacturing in California, and biotech. And I was trying to also make the argument that entertainment industry is a manufacturing job, but again, it didn't work. So the $750 million is now going to be applied in 3 different levels. $400 million of it is going to go towards manufacturing and biotech industries that which will receive credit through the sales tax, the state's sales tax portion Another 200 million is going to go towards new hires, employees that are hired into these businesses. And the third component is roughly about 150 million that the governor's office is going to be negotiating directly through his Go Biz office. A little while ago, I was talking about the Trade and Commerce Agency. With that now not in existence, what the governor has done in the vacuum of that agency is create Go Biz, which is a functioning group to make sure that they're the ones negotiating and trying to bring business into the state. So that 150 million is going to be used as a credit opportunity for them to try to lure in businesses from other states or other countries. This year saw several bills, roughly I think about 12 bills on hydraulic fracturing. Only one of them ended up passing. I had introduced a moratorium on hydraulic fracturing, or commonly known as fracking, because I thought it was important for us to consider what drilling today for oil is going to do to the heavy consequences of expense that it's going to create for us in the future because of the damage or contamination it's going to cause to our underground water. In Los Angeles alone, we rely on anywhere from about 11% to about 33% of our water source from our underground sources. And I'll talk to you about that. I'll get back to that in a second. The other area was, of course, gun and safety legislation. Thank you. It's great to have wonderful team members. By the way, I do want to recognize Steve, you already know. He's here on a monthly basis. And Mindy Lake, sitting right there taking copious notes. I started out as a field deputy myself and a staffer, so I have a soft spot for all the staffers. They work very hard. We get all the credit, they do all the work, so I just want to say thank you. There was several other staffers here as well, so I appreciate the work that they do. Thank you. Given the incidents in Colorado and Connecticut with the shootings, we saw about 20 pieces of legislation come about. Most of them ended up passing the state legislature. The governor was very selective on which ones he wanted to be signed into law for various reasons. And so some of them made it, some of them didn't. And I can get into the details of letting you know which were the ones that actually passed. I spoke to you about the ACA. By the way, the Affordable Care Act, basically what it does is it's going to allow a certain segment of the population to qualify who otherwise were not going to be able to qualify under Medi-Cal. Then it's going to come up with a tier structure of bronze, silver, gold, and platinum levels, allowing individuals, once they sign up, and this is very easy by the way, you can go to the website and you can fill out your information and you'll know automatically right on the website what tier you can qualify for. Based on those categories, you can figure out what area you'll qualify for and what your premium will be as opposed to your costs if you were to get something that would cover less of your expenses. And again, I'm hoping that this is going to live up to its expectation and expand coverage to over 2 million individuals. You know what? I will stop there with at least the legislation that.
Want to go to questions?
You know, let me just give you a quick update on something. I'll stop with the legislation overall, but I'll tell you that I was fortunate enough to have all six of my bills that made it to the governor's desk signed into law. One of them that had to do with water that I'll explain. Los Angeles Department of Water and Power is going to be embarking on a capital improvement project that's going to be very beneficial to us and our future in Los Angeles. We're going to be investing in building 2 water processing centers right here in Northeast San Fernando Valley that's going to be taking water from underground. By the way, we have about 180 pumps throughout the city that on a daily basis pump water from underground and it's put back into consumption use after being treated and processed. At any given time, roughly about 40% of the pumps are operating. because what's been going on over the decades with all the plume and all the contamination from manufacturing locations and sites, aerospace industry, car industry, what's happened is there is a contaminant that is moving around in the waterbed. And what happens is every time a certain pump, that contaminant plume comes close enough to a certain pump to be dragged up, that pump shuts down and another pump in another part of the city is reactivated so that the plume isn't taken up, because it's extremely costly to be able to clean that. What one of my bills did is allow the DWP to invest in the capital improvement of these two sites that are going to be the fastest in the world, 3 times faster than any water processing center in the world, in order for us to be able to clean up the plume and once and for all get rid of the contaminants underground, so we can reutilize a natural storage of aquifer that we have naturally underneath San Fernando Valley Basin. So I'm happy to talk about others, but there's also one bill that I got to mention, since one of the Sherman Oaks residents had inspired me to take on work. I'm very proud of my work with Jay Bieber to present a bill that passed the Assembly and it's now in the Senate Transportation Committee, and it's getting much notice. It has to do with increasing yellow lights by a second at intersections that employ a red light camera. The whole idea of that is, if we want to put red light cameras at those intersections for the safety of our drivers and pedestrians, then let's not just do it by the stick approach, let's also give the carrot approach and allow that 1 second for them to be able to make up their mind and slow down to stop. And or if they're going to be excelling and passing it, let them pass safely so that oncoming traffic doesn't hit them. So that's the whole intention of it. Surprisingly, I've gotten a lot of resistance, some of it coming from Metro, because Metro employs, out of the 420 intersections in the state of California that employ these red light cameras, LA Metro actually has 120 of them. So they've been, they haven't been too happy with my work on this, but I'm looking forward to pushing it forward. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's, Jay, why don't you come up here? You have a question there? I'm sorry, you can't pick your own question.
I do. I have Estelle Tenenbaum's question.
You gotta give it to, we've been through this. We've been around. We're not gonna have you have a friend write a
She
question.
handed it, and so I wanted to take it.
Okay, and as he picks the question, please, he's going to give the name, and if you can stand up so Adrin can address you when he answers, and as well as the audience. And Jay is very nervous. It's the first time he's done it. He didn't get much warning. I know he's an attorney, but he's not used to this, so the pressure is on him to do a good job.
Gee, thanks, Richard.
How did you know all that?
He's an attorney.
First question is from Ernie Goodman. Mr. Goodman? Mr. Goodman wants to know whether or not California has an oil extraction tax similar to Texas and Louisiana and some of the other states. If we do not, why not? Or if we do have one, why isn't it a heck of a lot larger than it is?
Bless you for the question. No, we don't. And that's what's so embarrassing. By the way, just so you know, I co-authored a bill written by Senator Mark Leno from San Francisco. All it did, simple task, all it did was ask the California Energy Commission to study the information that it's already receiving from oil companies and to figure out whether there's any type of a manipulation of oil pricing going on. That's all he did. Look, a little earlier I mentioned that all the fracking bills were killed except for one, and that fracking bill was authored by Senator Fran Pavley, which I also co-authored. What that did was just place regulations on the practice of fracking, which is a good first step. we should have done this maybe a decade ago when this issue wasn't even being talked about as much. But given that it's up centered now and in front of us, I think it was a first good step, but I think we still need to do more on this area. Now, California does not charge an oil extraction fee. And unfortunately, the Western States Petroleum Association, which is the lobbying arm of the oil companies, is extremely powerful. And so this one study bill that I was talking about got so much resistance that as a co-author and as a floor jockey, I had to take up this bill 3 times in a matter of 2 days in order to finally get 41 votes and be able to get it past the Assembly. It had passed the Senate, came to the Assembly, amendments were taken, finally passed, went back to Senate, barely passed there, went to the governor. Unfortunately, the governor didn't see the necessity of signing it into law, but I'm committed to continue working on this.
I heard on the news, I think it was today or yesterday, they all begin to run together now, that the United States is now the world's #1 oil exporter. We've passed Saudi Arabia. Where does California stand in the order of the oil-producing states?
I should probably know this off the top of my head. I don't
That's why
know.
I asked you.
Thank you. I don't know where we rank compared to Alaska and Texas, which are the largest oil-producing states. By the way, Alaska produces oil to the extent where their extraction fees and taxes require that the residents of Alaska not even pay taxes. In fact, in certain years, when production is so high, residents in the state of Alaska receive a check from their state government. So that's perspective. California, by the way, this fracking issue has become very important because California is sitting on roughly about 15 billion, if not more, barrels of oil that a lot of these companies are now, oil companies are looking at extracting. What's interesting is most of these sites are located in the Central Valley. And what's so interesting about that, and why I think my bill ended up not coming up to light for a vote in the legislature, was it was going to create a very difficult time for some of the legislators from Central Valley, because they're either going to be voting to support businesses, and this is I'm not being snooty about this. I think it was going to be a very challenging vote for most of them to make, because they're either voting against businesses earning income and employing their residents and constituents now, or they're going to have to carry the burden of paying for the cost of the cleaning up of the water that they're going to need to utilize for their farmland 20, 30 years from now. So it was a dilemma that I had tried to construct through my bill to make sure that this issue gets talked about. So I hope I've addressed the question. Bottom line is the oil company has been very powerful, and I'm not going to quit my work. And I think with a longer-term legislative service opportunity, if everyone is to be elected, you're also going to have folks that are going to be in the legislature long enough to be able to focus on this. And what I mean by this is the modification of term limits that took place last year. Now, assembly members, whoever was in my class, can serve, if re-elected, up to 12 years, and state senators can serve up to 12 years, and you're not going to see folks changing, swapping jobs. They're probably going to stay committed to their seats that they're in and work for the remainder of their terms in the respective houses that they're in.
Assemblyman, we have Sidonia Lax, there she is, asked an environmental question relative to the production of oil. One that relates to the pipeline that's before Congress from Canada to the Gulf ports. Would you support a pipeline system in California of an above-ground piping system?
Yeah, it's candid response. It's hard to give a response on something like this when I haven't had the opportunity to study the merits. So So I can't really tell you what I would do in that situation. By the way, that is a very difficult decision, by the way, that the president needs to make on that. I don't envy him at all, because again, there's some elements of it that could work, and there's many things, by the way, of this nature that you can apply to. Carrying energy from throughout the state. We're talking about renewable energy. What's renewable energy? It's all the different sources of elements that we can use. Wind, water, geothermal, and yet, in order to be able to construct a mechanism to be able to transfer energy from the desert to urban settings, because that's where we're going to capture the sun best, or in areas where there's high wind velocity and we can capture energy in those areas and bring it here, we're going to need to invest in the infrastructure. And if every community then says, well, not through my backyard, it's going to pose a very challenging circumstance to be able to actually do the right thing and rely less on fossil fuel.
Okay, let's change the subject a little bit. I think we have a number of people, maybe because of Chuck Betts' comments before we started, who asked questions about Proposition 13. Estelle Tannenbaum, Patricia, over here, and I think there were one or two others. If I don't call your name, accept my apologies. But how do you stand on maintaining Proposition 13 or changing it, perhaps with a view to making corporations more responsible with a change of ownership?
So I didn't get to read Estelle's question, but I knew she mentioned to me it's about Prop 13. So you can tell I wasn't going to hide the question. I was passing it on to you. When I stood before you as a candidate, I said this, and I'm going to repeat the same thing. My personal firm belief is that Prop 13 does need a modification. I want to protect the sanctity of Prop 13 when it comes to residential properties. That makes complete sense. In fact, even when it's commercial residential properties, I'm fine with that. But when it comes to corporations, I don't understand why we're giving corporate entities, which are not human beings, the opportunity to make money off of our hard-earned money. So I would very much like to look at how we can address Prop 13 in a way that only commercial entities pay their share of property tax at current market rates, but not touch the personal properties.
Do you have any sense of the mood in Sacramento for any change?
I don't think this governor is going to want to touch it. This is the same governor who 30 some years ago, was supportive of the measure that passed. Legislature's inaction at the time led to two propositions getting on the ballot. I think it was Proposition 9 and 13, and both passed. I think 9 would have been the moderate route. I shouldn't be saying all of this, by the way, in front of Richard. But Proposition 13 passed as well, and so what at that time looked great, it was a wonderful protection. At this point, I think it's important for us to consider if there's a way to protect and not change the residential component and just look at the corporate component, we may need to do that. By the way, just to give you a brief example, I have a jewel of a district, and one of the big businesses in the area that employs 600 individuals is the Anheuser-Busch Center Brewery. Thank you. Now, Anheuser-Busch was sold to a Belgian company in 2009, and it was still paying taxes of 1978 rates. That company was sitting on roughly over 1 million square foot property, and it was only paying, I think, about $10,000 or something that was completely out of context for what it was supposed to be contributing to the state and to us. When I say the state, ultimately that's being spent on services for us, for our children, especially with property taxes. So just to give a perspective.
And just with some background, at our February meeting, the president of the Howard Job Association, John Capal, will be here to address what is happening in Sacramento. February meeting, third Wednesday in February.
On campaign spending limits, the Supreme Court held in Citizens United 3 years ago that corporations could give an unlimited amount of money to candidates. They had the McCutcheon case in front of them, I think just a few days ago, which would apply that to individuals, so that individuals would be, within reason, almost unlimited in their campaign contributions. Would you support a spending limit, or how do you stand on spending limits for campaigns by individuals and or corporations in the state?
I may be a little too liberal on this, but I believe in...
You can't be too liberal.
I believe in the complete public financing of this. I don't understand why we, in the name of free speech, we've actually deteriorated speech. We've made it into sound bites, and you know, I like to joke around in smaller settings, so I hate to do this in a larger setting, but you know, in my race, one of my opponents was able to send out, I think, over 70 pieces of mail. I don't know what you as the voters, what all of us as the voters get out of that. So I don't think we've benefited from this argument that corporate entities are human beings and they can have no limit. So I actually would be an advocate for a public financing system.
That question was presented by Janet Cummels, by the way. I'm sorry not to have ascribed its origin. But here's one that no one signed. Dealing with the state lottery. Dealing with the state lottery. When the lottery was originally presented, at least according to the question, and it's probably right, over 30% of the monies collected were going to be applied to the school system. I don't know whether that part of it's right, or it's specifically right, but the idea being that those people who play the lottery play it partially because some of the funds are supposed to go to the state school system, and apparently only a couple of percent do. Is there any way we could change that and have the schools receive more funds?
So it was a great marketing in order to make sure that that measure passes. I don't think it was ever falsely advertised. I don't think it was ever 30%. In fact, I think it was specifically 3%. By and large, a good chunk of all the earnings or the revenue that's generated goes back into the prize money. And by the way, I see a head nodding in the back, so if I'm wrong about that, I'm happy to give the correct response. So I'll put it on Steve to make sure that he brings back the breakdown of what was expected. But by and large, I think roughly 85% of the revenues generated goes back into the prize money. There's about 10% that's used for administration. I think 3%, if I'm not mistaken, goes into the schools. So it's a drop in the bucket.
Would you support a reduction in the prize money and have some of that money go to the school system?
I would be, but I think it's a function of placing it back in front of the voters, because this was a voter mandate, and so it's going to take another measure to redo it.
So that the allocation of the funds are actually in the measure itself?
If I remember correctly, yes. I don't think that was left for implementation.
Charles Baker?
By the way, I'm happy to get back on that. So maybe by next month we'll have the specifics for that.
Mr. Baker asks where you stand on the bullet train.
That is a good question. I've never been crazy about it because of the infrastructural cost that's involved. I actually view it as a social justice issue. I think if we're going to be investing that much money, I'd rather see us invest that money in public short distance traveling. I think a lot more hardworking individuals rely on a bus mechanism that's lacking in our city and in our region that Metro serves, as opposed to something that's going to be catering to those individuals who are going to be using this ridership from Los Angeles to San Francisco. So I think there's a basic human inequity in this. I'm not crazy about that. But the other part of it is we're the 8th largest economy in the world. I think it is important for us to have such technology-based modes of transportation. But it's one of those things where I would prefer seeing the money spent elsewhere. Now, since again, this was a voter mandate, that money, that those funds are locked for the project that needs to be completed. Unless if there's another vote that takes that away, a ballot measure that takes that away.
Fran Fear and Bobby Baker both asked questions about the new driver's license program for illegal immigrants. Firstly, could you explain the program? Secondly, could you let us know whether or not there's a an English reading requirement, if not speaking requirement, so that the immigrants will understand the signs? And is there a method to enforce insurance, the mandate to have insurance when you take a driver's license? And I will tell you that in my experience, as a lawyer, I do see people, when they register the cars or when they get a driver's license, they have to have insurance, but then they'll get insurance on a month-to-month basis and won't renew it the next year. So if that's the case on a widespread basis, why doesn't the state have some method to check up on people and enforce the mandate that we all maintain liability insurance?
If we had the funds for enforcement, there was a lot of things, there was a lot of areas that we were going to be able to keep a tight control over, and not only generate the revenues that we're as a state being skipped out on, but also be able to manage those various industries or areas that we regulate to make sure that when a certain incident does occur, everyone is abiding by law and so everything will be covered. That's not the case. I mean, the reality is a lot of folks try to skirt their their obligations. But going specifically to the question at hand for driver's license. In fact, I'm happy to have Officer Tang in the corner to chime in at any given moment. But I supported this bill. I thought it was important for us to be able to put driver's license and enable all individuals who already use our roads to also be identified at a time of an incident, and for there to be a government-issued identification that everyone can use as the common medium or the basis of transaction, so that if there is an incident, the police officer involved can take that driver's license and know where the person is, who the person is, and there is a form of registration for that individual. Second, it actually is going to it has the potential of maybe even lowering our insurance costs. More people are going to be now covered, not considering what you're saying about the month-to-month, but if more people actually do now get coverage, it's actually going to help take the pinch off of all of us who are subscribing to the normal laws and have a driver's license and have been a paying insured member of the driving society. So, anything else I need to add, Officer Tang?
Well, you have to remember too, I haven't been, and I apologize for this, I haven't been. All right. I can speak louder too.
There you go.
I'm an officer, so my voice projects, so it's up to you. I can do microphone. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay, as an officer, I may be small, but I've got a very loud voice. Okay, so one of the things is that our commissioner and all of the chiefs of police here in the state of California, the reason why they endorsed this was because of what the assembly members said. We're going to have everyone biometric, right? They have to have a thumbprint, they have to have their photo, and we know who they are. Right now, if I were to go to and get a collision report, what do I get? I get a Mexico-issued counselor card that I can give any name I want, okay? And you'd be surprised what kind of names we get. And that is no positive identification as to who hit you. And then also keep in mind, do you need insurance for a license? No. Do you need insurance for registration? Okay, now you've had LAPD here many times talk about the license plate readers, right? The LPRs is what the captains usually call it. The license plate readers have a great effect for this very thing about uninsured motorists. Okay, and do you know what I'm talking about when I talk about uninsured motorists and the license plate readers? If you go month to month on your registration, your insurance, and you decide, I'm not going to pay my insurance, the DMV revokes your registration. Okay? The DMV pulls your registration. Now all of you are sitting here going, well, I've still got that sticker on my license plate, so King's X. No, the license plate reader, when they drive by that car, that entire computer screen turns red. And then we turn around and we pop that card and we pull it. So it's not just for stolen vehicles, it's also to protect all of us from the uninsured motorists. Okay, so that's an added benefit. So if we all get these individuals insurance, because now they can get insurance, because why? They've got a driver's license. So now they're not excluded to just one or two insurance companies, right, that issue. How many of you knew that? Did you know that there's about 3 or 4 insurance companies that just give you insurance and they don't care if you have a license or not? Did you guys know that? Yeah. There's at least 3 or 4 that give out insurance. They don't check to see if you have a license. And I'm sitting there going, are you crazy? All right, like all of you right now. So now you have a license, now you can get insurance from what? Allstate, Farmers, all the different insurance companies. And now they're not going to be paying these exorbitant inflated rates. Now they have enough money where they can get what? Full policies. How many of us have seen people get hit by somebody who has the basic comprehension collision, right? Yeah, there we go, right? So then that's the case where we can do what? They can now afford a better policy, and so then that way we all win, because now we don't have to be stuck fixing our cars. Their insurance will pay to fix our cars and hopefully pay for our deductibles and everything else, right? So that's what the assembly member is saying. It will really affect all of us in the long run. So it is an excellent bill. That's why a lot of people were very surprised that we were supporting it. So all the chiefs of police, the California State Chiefs of Police Association, the California State Sheriff's Association, they all, and these are the sheriffs of all 58 counties, they supported it because of that very reason. We'll be able to identify people better, and it will all ultimately affect all of us in the long run. Okay? Thank you. Thanks for
Thank you for that explanation. Assemblyman, it's my understanding that you favored SB 131, is that correct?
Remind me which one that is.
That's the law that allows
Yes.
children who are molested at school to file suit against certain privately run institutions, parochial schools or other private schools. Could you explain exactly what that legislation was designed to accomplish, why it did not include public schools in the legislation? And it's my understanding that it passed the state houses, but it was vetoed by the governor. Is that, if that's the case, could you explain your understanding of why he vetoed it?
I haven't had a chance to read his veto message on the bill, so I can't speak to that again. I'm happy to get that information out to you so that you have it for the next meeting. In my mind, it was a very distinct, first of all, the idea of this was to go after private areas of nonprofit or not-for-nonprofit operations. The intention of this wasn't to go after public schools. In the public arena, there are enough laws and regulations that address the issues. Now, I know there are many incidents that take place, but once those incidents take place, there's a proper course of action that takes place in order to dismiss, fire, or make sure that there's criminal charges brought to addressing the teachers or culprits that were involved. On the private front, or the non-public front, there aren't some of those stringent laws. And so this was an opportunity to reopen a timeline for statute of limitations